Jungle Book is a lasting gem in the Disney crown.
Have a banana.
It had a sense of perfection within itself.
As an animator, it's probably the greatest film in terms of character development and how characters play against one another.
Cool.
The animators poured their whole heart and soul into every scene in that movie.
I love The Jungle Book. I love it for its vitality, for its vivacity, for its sheer outrageousness.
Walt got something out of us that we didn't even know we had. Walt's holy grail was to make great pictures.
Walt could put his fingers on the total theme of a picture in a story so quickly. It influenced me all the way to go for the simple story and strong characters.
You want to know something? We're good sparring partners.
I had no idea, I'm sure he didn't either, that this was going to be the last animated film he'd ever make. It just embodied so many of the beliefs and the feelings that Walt wanted to imbue to the people. He poured himself into every sequence.
Hey!
It would be impossible not to look at Jungle Book and say, yes, of course, you can see it's got Walt's fingerprints all over it.
I think Walt had that genius of being his own best audience, and then a genius in executing his vision of what this medium could do. He was inspiring a group of artists never done it before.
Walt attracted strong personalities, great talents, and individualists like Bill Peet.
Bill Peet's one of the greatest story men that ever lived, someone who Walt had leaned on towards the end when his attention was being split by the parks and all of the things that Disney was getting into.
He had worked there since the 1930s, and he was really Walt's ace story man.
His fingerprints are all over all the Disney classics as a story man from pretty much Pinocchio on.
He had a sense of structure that was very helpful in an animated film.
Whenever there was a story problem, Walt would take it to Bill Peet.
I'm sorry, but I need your help. I was taken.
As Walt developed other interests in Disneyland and live action pictures, Bill Peet's skill in developing animated story actually freed him up to do other things.
Bill Peet single-handedly storyboarded 101 Dalmatians.
It wasn't done that way. Disney never had one person do the screenplay.
When they delivered the script, Disney said, great, go make it. And he really kept his hands off that film through the story process.
So Disney allowed him to do Sword in the Stone, do the same thing with that. And then it was actually Bill Peet who proposed The Jungle Book to Walt Disney. He said we could do more interesting animal characters.
Once Walt gave Bill the okay to start adapting Jungle Book from Kipling, Peet took the film in his own direction, as he usually did.
He read and read and reread The Jungle Book, and he began to come up with story sketches. And he showed them to Walt, and Walt liked them.
I had spent a lot of time going upstairs to the third floor to look at Bill Peet's storyboards. And I confess, the story that Bill was working on had me intrigued. I thought Bill was doing a fantastic job.
The Sword in the Stone, you know, that wasn't very well received.
Walt became a little bit more critical toward Bill Peet after Sword in the Stone.
He wanted to get much more involved in story than he had been in the previous couple, and he got all over Jungle Book.
There was also an additional problem. By the time that Walt headed in to The Jungle Book, he had reduced the whole animation operation so that there was a master animator who was the head of the entire operation, and that was Willie Reitherman. There was a single art director, Ken Anderson, and there were 4 supervising animators, Ollie Johnston, Frank Thomas, Milt Kahl, and John Lounsbury, all of whom were members of the famous 9 Old Men. And then there was one story man. And in the case of The Jungle Book, Bill Peet was really the story man. So it was Bill Peet's responsibility to devise the storyboards, to get the voices to be recorded, to record those voices. As Bill Peet himself once said, there were 40 people who were assigned to these jobs in the golden age of Disney animation. Now they were all being performed by one man, me, Bill Peet.
Bob and I had been staff writers at the studio for approximately 5 years by that time. And one day Walt called us in and said, I don't like the way Jungle Book is going. Bill Peet had written a very sincere version of Rudyard Kipling's telling.
He saw a film taking shape that was initially not the kind of film that he wanted to see. It was very dark, it was very brooding, it wasn't the kind of film that he'd envisaged being made of Kipling's stories.
Walt and Bill couldn't seem to reach agreement on the film's development, and the two of them, after all those years, broke up. Pete left the studio and never returned.
After Bill Peet left, Larry Clemens was given the job of putting together the story.
Well, when he put me on Jungle Book, that was my first writing on an animated cartoon feature.
Well, we were at this meeting, and the first thing Walt said, I remember, how many fellas have read the original Jungle Book story by Rudyard Kipling? And nobody said anything because nobody had read it. He says, good, I don't want you to read the book. Now here's the story. And with that, he launched into a typical Walt Disney storyteller. He's a master storyteller, the greatest storyteller you've ever seen. He characterized every personality with his face and his movements and his gestures. And he launched into how he wanted to tell the story. And he says, but I want it to be fun. I want this to be a fun story, an adventure with fun, no mysterious, none of this heavy stuff. And that's what he looked at us and he said, and I want to have a little heart in it too, you know what I mean?
We may look a bit shabby, but we've got hearts.
And feelings, too.
In those days, we developed the story visually. We worked from an outline, not conventional script pages, but from an outline by our writer, Larry Clemens.
Walt didn't want to read things. He'd rather see storyboard sketches. It was visual, you could see it, you could see the action.
The whole idea of being a Disney story artist is that you're supposed to be able to take a bare bones outline and develop the character, add whatever entertainment value you can.
Walt liked people around him that were willing to try and dare, even though they didn't know quite where they were going or why even. But most of all, he stressed personality.
You better believe it, and I'm loaded with both.
When Walt Disney visited a project, he changed the project. And perhaps the most dramatic way in which he changed the project was with Phil Harris.
We went through a lot of bears before we got Phil, and none of them seemed to be right. And finally, Walt says, why don't you try Phil Harris? And of course, some of the animators said, Phil Harris in a Rudyard Kipling film? And Walt says, why not? We're going to make our own Jungle Book, and we'll do it our way.
You better believe it.
Once Walt had heard the audition, Walt went bananas. He loved it. It was one of those things that kind of triggered things in Walt and got him excited.
Walt cared most about entertainment, and I think it shows in how the story was worked out.
We'd start with the main sequence in the middle of the picture, not the beginning, where all the main characters in it. We'd learn our characters, and then from there we'd expand either way.
Nice footage that flowed and was very entertaining, but we had no tiger in the picture yet.
The tiger? Sooner or later, Mowgli will meet Shere Khan.
I suggested to Walt in this meeting, don't you think this is a good time to just get an outline here so we know where we're heading?
Walt said, you guys don't worry about that icky, sticky story stuff. You leave that to me.
He wanted to get in closer on the characters. The story, the plot was of secondary importance to him. Jungle Book was very difficult for me to work on. I just never knew where I was or what was going on.
Nobody knew at that certain point how to finish the storyline because the relationship between Baloo and the boy was so strong now that how could you possibly have Baloo acquiesce to letting the boy go into the man village?
And then they got to the end of the film and they didn't have an ending. So at one meeting, apparently Walt said, well, why not have the little girl from the village entice Mowgli? Ollie Johnston, who was supposed to animate that, was appalled. He thought that was a terrible ending.
Ollie was telling later on, and the more he thought about it, the way he would do it, the more he really got into it and found a really sensitive way of doing that. You know, it's very casual and I don't want to say tasteful.
And that's the love story. It is a little tenderness, a little sweetness, and also the bittersweet idea of the fact that Baloo really wants the boy to come with him, but he and Bagheera go off together.
Kipling book is very dark and very mysterious and a terrific book. But I think Walt was very, very canny in wanting to go a completely different direction with it.
It's possibly, I think, the most bright and breezy, freewheeling, happy-go-lucky, upbeat of all Disney's movies.
It bears very little resemblance to the original Rudyard Kipling, but I don't think that's what Walt wanted. Walt always wanted things that had characters in them that engaged the audience, and I think this film delivers in spades that way.
Sometimes a storyline that's too complicated can get in the way, and Jungle Book had the simplest storyline ever.
I don't want to go back to the man village.
The storyline didn't get in the way of the characters, is the beauty of that little picture.
I want to be like you. I want
Can learn to be like someone like me.
that.